In this lesson, we're going to see the relationship between fractions, decimals, and percents. So if we look at example 1, it says the portion of the time that Teddy spends doing homework for each subject is shown on the bar diagram, this diagram to the right. How can you write the amount of time Teddy spends on reading or science as a fraction, decimal, and percent? So the reasoning, it says fractions, decimals, and percents are 3 ways to show parts of a whole. How can you use reasoning to write quantities as a fraction, a decimal, or a percent? And when we solve these questions, we're going to be using this chart that I have on the right side of the screen that you should also have in front of you. So the first direction says to write 30% as a fraction and as a decimal. So we have to figure out, well, what are we starting with? Is 30% a fraction, a decimal, or a percent? 30% is a percent. So we're going to start by writing 30% in our chart. 30%. Okay, so now we want to write that 30% as a fraction. Well, look, when we go from percent to fraction, it says to write over 100. Anytime you see that percent sign, you know that to write it as a fraction, that means we're doing 30 over 100. And you should be filling this in on your chart. So now 30 over 100, we should try and simplify that. When I see that there's numbers that end with a 0, that means that we could divide both of these by 10. To simplify a fraction, that means we're dividing the top and the bottom by the same number. So I'm going to divide 30 by 10 and 100 by 10. So 30 divided by 10 would be 3. 100 divided by 10 would be 10. So 30% as a fraction is 3/10. So now I want to convert my fraction to a decimal, and look at what it says. When we go from fraction to decimal, we divide, and you can just put that into your calculator. 3 divided by 10. We should remember that fractions are the same thing as division. 3 divided by 10 is 0.3. So on our chart right here, we just went from percent to fraction to decimal. So 30% is the same thing as 3 over 10, 3/10 written as a fraction, which is the same thing as the decimal, 3/10. Now let's try the next question. The next question says, write 1/10 as a fraction and as a percent. So let's look at what we have here. Write 0.10. Okay, so I'm starting with a decimal. 0.10. So now how do I write that decimal as a percent? My clue on my chart says I'm going to be moving my decimal twice to the right. Once, twice to the right. So that number is now 10%. Okay, so the decimal 0.10, I move the decimal twice to the right. That gives me 10%. To write 10% as a fraction, I look at the top of my chart. I'm going to write my number 10 over 100. 10 over 100. And we can simplify again. Look, it ends in a 0. That means it's divisible by 10. We can divide both the top and the bottom by 10. 10 divided by 10 is 1. 100 divided by 10 is 10. So 0.10 as a decimal is the same thing as 10%, which is also the same thing as 1/10 as a fraction. Example 2 says, express fractions as parts of a whole. So Teddy spends 3/5 of his homework time doing math problems. Write 3/5 as a decimal and as a percent. Okay, so 3/5. Will we be writing 3/5 as a fraction, a decimal, or a percent? 3/5, right? Looks like that. So 3/5 is a fraction. So we're going to be starting in our fraction box, 3/5. So now looking on your chart, how do you go from a fraction to a decimal? Fraction to decimal, you divide in your calculator. So what's 3 divided by 5? You should get 0.6. And how do you go from decimal to percent? You move the decimal twice to the right. I have to fill in that space with a 0. So 3/5 is the same thing as 0.6, which is the same thing as 60%. And we started with a fraction, so you don't have to convert that percent back to a fraction. One last question. Example 3. Teddy's friend Jacob spends 5/8 of his homework time doing math problems. Write 5/8 as a decimal and as a percent. So 5/8. Will we be starting 5/8 as a fraction, a decimal, or a percent? 5/8 is a fraction. So let's fill in 5/8. Let's convert 5/8 to a decimal. What should you do? We should put it in our calculator. 5 divided by 8 is 0.625. How do I go from decimal to percent? I move my decimal twice to the right. Rewrite it, 62.5%. Remember, when you move that decimal, there's only one number in each of those loops.